Hey movie people, it's me Drew and welcome back. This week I watched the film Stowaway and felt compelled to talk about it. There's a few things that I really enjoyed about it, and it's, to me, a perfect video to talk about on this channel. But before we get into it, if you like what I do here, I release movie-related content every week, and all you gotta do is scroll down and subscribe. And if you see the bell icon, just take your laptop or whatever device you're holding and slam it against the nearest hardest object. And as always, these videos feature pretty heavy spoilers, so if you haven't seen Stowaway already, I implore you to go watch it, because A, it's a phenomenal movie, and B, you're gonna get it spoiled here, so there's no need to do that to yourself. Because of streaming and really just the need for instant gratification these days brought about by social media and technology, it can be very important to hook the audience in the very opening of your film. A good way to do that is to open a film in an exciting or tension-filled manner, just to keep the audience's attention. You'll find a ton of films of all shapes and sizes do this these days, some better than others. But I think it'd be interesting to see if there's a discrepancy between the films that are released in theaters and strictly on streaming. Because at home, it's a lot easier to just whip out your phone and look at it, whereas in theaters, if you do that, you could initiate some sort of violence, but I digress. The best example of a bad attention-grabbing opening that I can think of is that stereotypical cold open where they flash forward to an event that's happening later on in the film and then say, but wait, let me start from the beginning. I'm actually having trouble thinking of a film that does this right now, but maybe later in editing, if I think of something, I'll throw it in here.
That's a Jericho 941 pointed at my head. My name is David Packows, and I'm an international arms dealer.
But the fact that it's become a meme should probably be case in point. And I've told you all of this just to praise Stowaway. It's the prime example of creating an opening that's enticing but also serves the story. Within the first 10 minutes, we learn all we need to know about the characters, their interpersonal dynamics, the role that they serve, and what type of story this is going to be. The camera opens on our protagonist Zoe. By the way she's dressed and the radio communications, we can tell that she's an astronaut getting ready to head into space. As they take off, we see her anxious, but we also see her smile a number of times, giving us the indication that her excitement is somewhat outweighing the anxiety of the moment. Next, we get a glimpse of the pilot, Commander Barnett. She seems emotionless and is completely unaffected by the anxiety of the launch. This gives us a hint that she's done this before. She's also the only person with an active line of communication to Hyperion or Mission Control, and that's another hint to later on as well. And last but not least is David Kim, who seems as calm and collected as the pilot until they enter space, and then his anxiety starts to kick in, giving us the indication that he's much more comfortable on Earth, or at very least, there's something about space that he doesn't quite like. Each character gets their 2 seconds of fame, and then immediately afterward, we're confronted with our first environmental conflict.
Hyperion, the main engines are underperforming slightly.
Copy, main engines underperforming.
Good read.
The engines are underperforming, and they're consuming more fuel than previously thought. This in and itself is a hint that the payload is a bit heavier than expected, or really just a setup for the later reveal that there's someone else on board. In this life or death situation where every second counts, Commander Barnett's first move is to tell Hyperion about it, and then she informs the crew to lower their visors.
Flip your visors down.
This tells us two things. One, that she's in charge of the crew, and two, given what we know about her, that she is somewhat experienced, that she holds a lot of faith in what Hyperion is saying and trusts them to a certain degree. Then we wait for a few seconds of terror as Hyperion remains silent. Barnett's finger hovers over the abort key. This tells us that she has trouble making executive decisions until Hyperion weighs in.
Hyperion?
Meanwhile, while the tension is building, we're asking the same questions as the crew. What's taking them so long to respond? Is Hyperion doing shady corporate shit? On the edge of our seat, the tension is suddenly relieved when Hyperion calls back and says everything is fine. This tells us that Hyperion weighs all of their options very carefully, but also, more importantly, that they have the very best intentions of the whole crew in mind. In the final moment, Zoe looks out the window and admires Earth from afar. Meanwhile, David is looking kinda sick. In terms of openings, you don't get much better than that. In 10 minutes, you get an attention-grabbing thrill ride, character dynamics, you get the nature of the conflict, and it all serves the story. Something you probably already know about me is that I'm a huge stickler for scientific accuracy in movies, especially in space movies that try to take themselves seriously. Especially after that one time I got into how the animated feature Soul sort of abides by quantum mechanics and string theory. The scientific accuracy in this movie fucking amazed me. The spacecraft that they fly in, called the Kingfisher, utilizes centripetal force to simulate gravity. This isn't really a new concept in science fiction films. You can see this technique used in films like 2001: A Space Odyssey. One major problem with simulating gravity like this, though, is that if the mechanism isn't long enough, the G-force you experience at your feet is going to feel different than the G-force you experience at your head. That uneven distribution can cause a lot of nausea. YouTuber Joe Scott made an incredible video explaining this, which I'll link down below. The gravity system incorporated in Stowaway is actually based on a concept which is discussed in that video, so if you're interested in that at all, I would recommend going to watch that. It's a great video. But for those of us that are lazy, a ship of this design with 2 units attached to a large centrifuge would need to be about 100 meters across and rotate about 3 times per minute to simulate 1 G-force of gravity, which is what we experience here on Earth.
Climb the tether? All the way? That's 450 meters.
The Kingfisher is said to be 450 meters across, and using my brilliant skills with mathematics, I've determined that to be exactly less needed rotation. That of course means less nausea, which means that this spacecraft is even more plausible than the bare minimum. Considering that the director of Stowaway, John Penna, had his start on YouTube, I wouldn't doubt that he maybe even watched the Joe Scott video and decided that he wanted to incorporate that somewhere in one of his films. The other moment I found scientifically gripping was at the end during the solar storm. The astronauts are taking refuge in a magnetic proofing room.
This is the magnetic radiation proofing. In case there's a solar storm, come in here.
My best understanding of this would be that the room generates its own magnetic field to protect the crew from solar radiation and charged particles. It's basically what Earth does naturally with its own magnetic field, only on a much smaller scale. But what was more interesting for me during the scene was Zoe's spacewalk. If you thought it was weird that she was getting holes blown in her while she was climbing the rope, even though she had a suit around her, would you believe me if I told you that's exactly what would happen? Heavy solar protons would puncture the skin and cause damage to tissue, but would pass through space shielding or suits relatively unscathed. And by unscathed, I mean a human probably wouldn't even notice that there were holes. It's a lot different when those heavy solar particles are being punched through biomass, though. Imagine a million tiny bullets being sent through your body every minute or so. If you're lucky enough to survive those bullets, though, you're pretty much definitely going to die of radiation poisoning, or if you're lucky, maybe a few years later of cancer. Isn't space travel fun? And last but not least, would this even be one of my videos if we didn't throw some social commentary into here? I think Stowaway is prime real estate for the color-conscious versus color-blind casting debate. Color-conscious casting, or non-traditional casting, is a term that's thrown around a lot these days. Basically, it's writing characters with color, race, or gender identity in mind and utilizing those aspects in the story. This lays opposite color-blind casting, or traditional casting, which asks the audience to suspend reality and glimpse into a world where these things don't matter. There's a lot of debate over which of these philosophies should be employed, and personally I think that's a bit of a false dichotomy. I don't think there's a wrong answer. Movies can be a form of escapism, especially these days for people seeking a fleeting reprieve from the hellscape that is the real world. Not to mention colorblind casting can have the effect of opening up race or gender ambiguous roles to whosoever has the best talent, which can result in greater representation for more people, but also better employment for more people. But sometimes to include a powerful theme or message, or to reflect the real world in some way, it's better to write in a color-conscious manner. Now, anytime I watch a movie with a person of color or a non-binary character, my brain immediately starts contemplating which of these philosophies the director took on. I think Stowaway is definitely written in a color-conscious manner, and it's meant to be a microcosm of society. Michael Adams is a character that was never meant to be here, and through no fault of his own, ends up in a hopeless situation millions of miles from home. For a majority of the film, the 3 major crew members are deciding this man's fate behind closed doors, while he lives in idyllic bliss. In a scene that felt very reminiscent of today, Commander Barnett even calls Michael a danger to the crew.
Realistically, every day he's still here, it's a danger to all of us. I am telling you. Look, we were chosen to be here. We've been trained psychologically and otherwise. He hasn't. He can't contribute to any of this in any meaningful way. So I think the best course of action is to just keep this between us.
Of course, in a vacuum, like space, what she's saying makes sense. Michael hasn't had their training, and every second he's there does present a danger to the crew. But there's a reason he doesn't have their training, and there's a reason that he brings added danger. Because he was never really meant to be here. He was taken here against his will. And refusing to tell him what's happening right away, and by extension his right to choose, she's creating a strange power divide between the crew and Michael. It seems logical here, so you can see how these horrible ideas start to take root in society. It sounds familiar, does it not? This is why the decision to make the character of Michael black was very well thought out, at least in my eyes. I think you could probably make a case for the opposite being true, being that it was actually colorblind casting and this stuff wasn't thought about, and I was just reading into it way too much. So what do you think? Was the film written in a color conscious or a color blind manner? Let me know in the comment section. Also, please let me know what you thought of the film. Personally, I loved it, and I think it gets a big fat F for fucking awesome. I'm not quite sure what I'm gonna be discussing next week, so be sure to keep an eye out on social media and Discord if you'd like to stay up to date. And as always, I hope to see you next week.